Welcome everyone, not only to a direct talk, but to the first direct talk of hopefully many more to come. In these talks, we'll give the floor to researchers within the field of computer science and digitalization, and we're off to a great start with Claus Brabrand, an associate professor at the IT University of Copenhagen. In this talk, Claus will present his answer to the following question: how can we encourage more women to study computer science? He has a long list of merits that makes him the person to answer this question, but to mention a few, he is the writer, director and co-producer of the award-winning educational short film Teaching, and Understanding, used around the world for educational development. He has designed educational materials for most of ITU's main initiatives aimed at increasing student diversity. He is heading the recently opened Center for Computing Education Research at ITU, and he is the first recipient of the Danish National Teaching Award, giving to 2 out of approximately 18,000 university teachers in all of Denmark. The award was handed over by Her Royal Highness Princess Mary of Denmark, along with 500,000 Danish kroners. Last thing before I hand over the mic to Claus, we'll have time for some questions at the end of this talk, so if you have any, please go ahead and write in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them and see how many Claus will be able to answer at the end of his talk. And this talk is being recorded, just for your information. That's it. No more talk from me. Claus, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Give me this one. Thank you very much. Thank you. So as was said, the title here of this talk here is how can we encourage more women to study computer science? But I actually also probably would like to maybe title it like this, which is a related question and possibly a more general question is how to increase the diversity in computer science. So it turns out that these are very related issues, and this is actually a more general issue. So if we look first at diversity and connect this to DIREC, this sort of takes place in the context of DIREC Workstream 12.2, which is on the topic of diversity. And the title of that project is called Supporting Diversity via Inclusive Teaching Learning Activities. And the workstream is, leader is Mikkel Bavn Kjærgaard from SDU, and I am the project manager for Workstream 12.2 about diversity. And the mission of this particular workstream is, as it says here, to increase the diversity of students in the computer science educational programs at all the Danish universities. So let's have a look at how we can go about doing that. But first, before we start, I want to say just one more word about diversity. And that is that this is sort of inherently multidimensional. So most people, when you talk about diversity, or a lot of people will immediately think about gender. And indeed, this is also one of the ones that probably has been sort of worked the hardest on addressing, at least in Denmark. But we have a number of other dimensions as well. So in particular, diversity regarding the prior programming experience of students starting in computer science. We also have academic family traditions and culture, ethnicity, and LGBT, and so on. So there's a lot of different dimensions involved here. And a lot of the things I will be talking about actually applies in a more general scenario here. So I would like to start with a problem. So the problem is the following. So according to Eurostat in 2019, only 18% of people working in ICT jobs in the EU were women. And I'll give you 3 reasons for why this is a problem. So first, if we consider this from an organizational perspective, we get some interesting data here from the EU that says that over half, indeed 53% of all EU companies that recruited or tried to recruit ITC specialists had difficulties in filling these vacancies. And again, this is from Eurostat. So there's a lot of need for IT specialists. And if we look closer to home, There was a report out very recently made for the Danish high schools and the Engineering Association, IDA, says that, or estimates that Denmark will be 22,000 ICT specialists short by the year 2030. And clearly we have a problem if we're recruiting from only sort of half the talent pool. So this is sort of an organizational perspective on why it would be good to get more women into the area of computing. The second perspective is sort of a societal perspective. And I brought a picture here of a seatbelt for cars because this is an interesting case to talk about. So the risk here is that products developed by a minority risks of their coming with an possibly unconscious bias. So this being the case sort of by men for men is often also talked about. So in the case of the seatbelt, it turns out that since the 1950s, the safety of the car was modeled over the 50th percentile male. So if we look here at these well-known crash test dummies here, this indeed is one of the most used ones. It's called the Hybrid 3, 50th percentile male. And if we look at the dimensions of this particular crash test dummy, 175 centimeters and 78 kilograms. So it wasn't until the year 2011 that the US adopted a quote-unquote female crash test dummy. And actually, that happens to just be a scaled-down version of the male dummy. So the problem is that these cars have been tested with male crash test dummies for half a century. And indeed, the numbers show, it turns out that women are much more likely to get injured or actually die in a crash. And this is sort of one of the scary examples when you have technology that's developed by a minority. Probably none of this was sort of deliberate, but these are the problems we run into. The third problem with this is what you might call the individual perspective. And indeed, women may be missing out on good career opportunities. So we know that in computing and computer science is sort of you can work with anything you want, and you also have great potential for actually changing the world and impacting the world in a positive way. So these were sort of the three arguments for why I think it's important to try to address these problems. So if we look at the situation from the IT University of Copenhagen, turns out that in 2015 there were only 10% women on the Bachelor of Computer Science. So I brought some statistics along here. So we see, and we only had around 10%. And indeed, this was a problem. And in 2016, ITU decided to do something about it, and a range of initiatives were launched. So on recruitment, onboarding, and retention. And I've deliberately given you sort of a cliffhanger here. I'll address this black box later on. So let me talk a little bit about solution, or actually solutions. So it's very important to mention that this is plural because there are a lot of things that can be done. First off, it's very important to mention that there's sort of no magic silver bullet which will immediately solve all the issues, but there are a lot of things that can be done. So indeed, our communication department here at the ITU have done lots of work on this. So their strategy has been to show women that what computer science or computing, what it really is. Turns out that a lot of high school students don't really have maybe the right idea of what computer science really is. Also about showing women that they actually fit in. So a lot of women believe that they don't fit in with the environment. And clearly here, addressing the environment, avoiding stereotypes is very, very important. Also, showing women that they can actually do it. And again, a lot of high school students, and in particular women, believe that they can't program or they will not be able to do these things. But as we all know, programming is actually not all that hard. And it's something everyone can learn to do, just like you can learn how to read and write. And finally, showing women that it can be used to address real and important problems out there in reality. So this has been the four sort of cornerstones that communication department here at ITU have been working on for the past half a decade. So, and there are lots of other things that can be done, like avoiding stereotypical communication, using female role models, favor collaboration over competition, and so on. So there are lots and lots of things that can be done. But I want to talk about two sort of specific things. And so the first study I want to talk about, we call it the people versus things study. And the background for this was a 1998 study by Richard Lipper, who showed that there was a correlation between gender and interests in vocational tasks, so job tasks, on a somewhat unfamiliar spectrum, namely the people versus things, or the people-things scale, or the people-things spectrum. So he established in 1998 empirical evidence that women are on average more interested in working with people than men are, and on the other hand, men are on average more interested in working with things than women are. So this was sort of inspiration for us, and we set out to sort of try to take advantage of this and designing an experiment specifically in the context of computer science education. So instead of looking at sort of an older context, we wanted to study this in a contemporary context. And instead of considering US American psychology students, which were the subjects of that experiment, we wanted to have a look at Danish students. And finally, most importantly maybe, we wanted to change from general context to a specific computer science tasks. So this is research done by an interdisciplinary team. So Melissa Høgh Marker, who is a computer science student, Ingrid Maria Christensen, also a computer science student, Pavel Grabarczyk, who is a philosopher of technology, Therese Graversen, who is a professional statistician, and then myself, I'm working on computing education. So we did 2 studies, and I'll show you briefly both of these. So very recently we published these 2 studies in the ACM Conference on International Computing Education Research. The first involved an experiment, it was on an experiment involving about 500 high school students, and the second experiment involved about 150 university students. So if we first take a look at the first experiment involving the high school students, we did the following. We took 4 representative computer science tasks. So these were task number 1, developing a website. Task number 2, summarize an article on artificial intelligence. Task number 3, evaluate a mobile app presentation. And the 4th task was to complete some programming exercise. So each of these 4 tasks we made in 2 versions, or 2 isomorphic versions. The first was a people version of the task, and then we made a things version of the task. And we took great length in making sure that they were equal in all respects apart from sort of the overall theme, so that they would be sort of isomorphic. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that because it's very important. First, we made sure they were semantically isomorphic. So the first, the people version here was about getting compatible personality or people into a project group. And the things version was about getting compatible spare parts and have them fit together into a machine. So for both of these, we see sort of a notion of parts to whole composition. You put things together, either people to form a project group or spare parts to form a machine. And again, the overall theme is about compatibility, things fitting together. And the constituents, the parts, were over here were project members, and over here were spare parts. And the notion of a whole in the people case was a project team, and the notion of a machine in the things version. We also made sure that the phrasing of the tasks was as syntactically isomorphic as possible. So all the sentences had equivalent grammatical structure. We see example here with the people version, compatible personality types. So that's adjective, noun, and noun in plural form. And isomorphically, the things version would then have compatible spare parts. And we applied this to entire sentences. So for instance, here is a sentence from the people version. It says, It's important for the manager to have an overview of employees at all times. And isomorphically for the things version, it's important for the factory to have an overview of the machines at all times. And finally, we made sure that sort of they were compositionally isomorphic. So here's an image from the people version and an isomorphic image from the things version. For both of these, we have the instigator sort of performing the action, either a person here or a robot, slightly to the right of the center. The action is towards the middle. The background is mostly irrelevant, and most colors are sort of pale orange and yellow colors. And finally, all the figures that were used, and that's not shown here, were also visually sort of isomorphic. Good. So we had 4 tasks in 2 different versions, a people and a things version. The participants of the experiment were 500 high school students. The teachers were obviously informed about the nature of the experiment, but we deliberately kept this from the student to avoid them interfering, possibly subconsciously, with the experiment. So the survey was done online because of the corona pandemic. Students gave explicit consent to participate, and they answered some background information, mostly for excluding outsiders, not in the intended audience here of Danish high school students. And they provided a self-identified gender, and they provided their extent of prior programming experience. And finally, they gave their people versus things preference for each of the 4 tasks. And this was done on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 represents a strong preference for the people version, 3, for instance, represents indifference, and 5 would represent a strong preference for the things version. If we have a look at the results, we see the results here as histograms with women in dark green and men in light green. If we consider the rating of a 1 corresponding to a strong preference for the people version, we see that that was the case for more than half of the women, whereas this was only the case for 27% of the men. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, we see that almost none of the women had a strong preference for the things version, whereas this was the case for about 16% of the men. If we look at a smoothed version of the diagram, we see the tendency more clearly that women have a preference towards the people end of the spectrum, whereas the men are sort of more uniformly distributed. If we consider the other tasks, so this was task number 1, we see a similar trend in that the women consistently exhibit preferences towards the people end of the spectrum. We did a statistical analysis on this, and you can we quantified the odds of how likely a student is to answer in the direction of people. And if you do this for men and women, you can then compute an odds ratio, which is the ratio between, for instance, men versus women. And if we do this odds ratio analysis, we get a ratio of 2.7. I'll interpret that in 1 second, but we notice that the effect is strongly statistically significant. We have a p-value of 10 to the minus 13th. Here is the 95% confidence interval, placing this odds ratio well above 1. So a ratio of 2.7 means that the odds of a woman rating in the direction of people are 2.7 times higher than those of a man. So this is a highly significant effect of gender. If we also consider the effect of inexperience, which, by the way, when looking at gender, we controlled for experience, and looking for experience, we controlled for gender. So looking at the effect of inexperience, and this inexperience is prior program inexperience, we see a similar pattern. We see that students, men and women who are inexperienced, who have not programmed before, have a strong preference for the people version, whereas the ones with experience are more uniformly distributed. We see this again here. And if we analyze the data, we get an odds ratio of 1.4 and a statistically significant p-value here. And again, the interpretation is that the odds of student without programming experience rating in the direction of people are 1.4 times higher than those of the students who entered university, who had prior programming experience. So it's interesting to note that we have a gender effect here of 2.7 and an inexperience effect of 1.4. So you may obviously ask the question, what about women without programming experience? And since these are odd ratios and there's no interference between these two effects, they're actually multiplicative. So you can combine the two, and if you consider the odds here, the combined odds, they give you an odds ratio of 3.8, and the interpretation of that is that the odds of women without prior programming experience rating in the direction of people are almost 4 times higher than that of men with prior programming experience. And this is interesting because computer science, at least historically, recruited a lot of men with programming experience. And if you want to extend recruitment and try to recruit more women and more students without programming experience, in particular women without programming experience, this is really an effect that you need to pay attention to. So let me switch perspective a little bit here. So instead of considering now recruitment in high school, let's have a look at the situation at university and consider retention. So we switch from this experiment to another experiment. We did a related experiment at university involving about 150 university students. So we're going to switch perspective from high school to university, and indeed from prospective to current students. And it also means that we're switching now from hypothetical tasks. I forgot to mention that the high school students, they were given these tasks and they didn't necessarily have the competencies to perform these exercises, so they basically chose between the ones that they would imagine they would like to do. So in this case, we're dealing with university students, so they actually will have the competence to make these, and so we considered in this experiment real tasks. So it's important to mention that there is sort of an ethical consideration here. So if you then would proceed to lure a lot of students in with promises of this being about people, and they show up first day in computer science class, and then it's all about gadgets and things. This we find to be highly unethical. So if you make promises of things being about people, you have to also deliver on these promises in the education. So what we did in this context is we took 3 mandatory assignments, and this took place in the context of the 15 ECTS introductory programming course, which in the computing education literature is called the CS1 course. So the first semester university course where the students learn to program. So, and this was at the Bachelor of Software Development at ITU. And we had about 180 students registered, and we took 3 mandatory hand-in assignments, named the one they were called B, C, and D, and we cast those in 2 versions. So there was a people version and an isomorphic things version. And then the students could freely choose which one of these they chose to make hand in. So and the 3 exercises B, C, and D were about entity management. So the people version was about managing employees, whereas the things version was about managing storage. Assignment C, the people version was about booking people in a hotel, and the thing version was about booking containers on a cargo ship. The D version here was, the D assignment was about tracking customers, and the thing version was about tracking electricity. So people and things. And again, here are the results. So first for assignment C, and again we have the women in dark green. So we see the women exhibiting a strong preference for the people version P here, and a lot fewer women chose to hand in the things version of assignment C, whereas we see the men almost at a 50-50. If we consider assignment B, there's a similar picture, albeit with a less pronounced tendency. And finally, for D, we see an even more pronounced effect. Indeed, more than 90% of the women chose to do and hand in the people version, and then obviously less than 10% of the women did the things version. If we run the statistical analyses, we get odds ratios ranging from 1.7 to about almost 12. And for the last two of these, they are statistically significant. Interestingly, if we consider the consistency of choices, so these are now the data from all the students who handed in all three assignments, B, C, and D. And the way you read this is 2 out of 3 P means those are the students that elected to do 2 people assignments, and then obviously, since they were handing in all 3, the last would then be a thing version. So over here we have the students who only handed in people versions, and students over here at the other end of the spectrum who only handed in things versions. We see that exactly half of the women chose to do only people versions, whereas, now that's messing up a little bit, whereas none of the women, it should say none, I don't know what's wrong with the slides. None of the women, we can see it here, none of the women chose to do only things versions. Whereas we see the males with a slightly uniform perspective here. Good. So let me give you a recommendation based on this. We believe that educators should consider favoring themes involving people over those involving things in computing educational activities and computer science activities. And we do this as it appears to increase the appeal of the activities to women with this very non-trivial effect, and also for inexperienced students and especially inexperienced women with an even stronger effect. So this would be our recommendation based on these research here. If you want more information, I only presented this very quickly. We have a website here dedicated to these 2 pieces of work. And here, if you go here, you are going to find a 3-minute research film that we produced very recently. It's actually shot with drones and dollies, so Hollywood-style cameras. And you will also find a 10-minute video lecture on the first study, the high school or the recruitment study. There's also the paper available there. And similarly, you're going to find a 10-minute video lecture on the retention perspective. And there's also the other paper available there involving the university students. Good. Let me switch now to the second study I'm going to talk about, which is the effect, and actually the effects of an onboarding course that we have been running for the past 5-6 years here at the IT University of Copenhagen, which is trying to give inexperienced students who apply for computer science and then start with no programming competencies. We give them a 3-day onboarding course. So it looks something like this. The course is called Booted, and it's a pre-university elective course for students without prior programming experience. In the literature, these type of courses are often called CS0. And our particular version here runs 3 days in mid-August since 2016. And the course is intended to give hands-on introduction to programming. So let's have a look at a little bit at the effects here. So the first, and so this research is done by Sebastian Matthäus Nicolajsen, computer science student, Paweł Grabarczyk, philosopher of technology, and then myself. So, and we analyzed the effects of this course here by comparing data from about 800 students over a period of 5 years. So that is 271 students who applied for to get into this Bachelor of Software Development, but they did not have any programming experiences, and they were offered this onboarding course, versus 527 students who had prior experience and then did not go through this onboarding course. We see the amount of people attending Booted every year is between 50 and 60 students. So the first observation here is the literature actually tells us that inexperienced students, their grades will be worse in a mixed CS1 class. Recall CS1 is the introductory programming, the course where the students learn to program. So if you put together students without prior experience with the ones with experience, then the literature tells us that inexperienced students are going to be worse off. This is not what we saw. We actually saw, so here are the grade distributions for the ones attending booted without prior programming competence versus the ones here who did not attend booted who had prior programming competencies. Basically almost no difference. If we look at the averages, the difference is almost nothing here. It's 0.12 grade points. And recall that the difference between two grades is actually 3, sometimes 2 points in the Danish grade scale. So this is a very negligible difference here. And indeed, the statistical analysis cannot tell these two cohorts apart. We get a p-value of 0.55. So if we look at the dropout rates, again, the literature tells us that inexperienced students will drop out more frequently. This is not what we saw. So after them having this 3-day onboarding course, the number of students who came with no prior programming experience and went through this onboarding class, 17 out of 271 dropped out. That's 6.3%. And coincidentally, exactly the same number for among the students who came with programming experience and hence did not attend this onboarding activity. We see a similar trend for second semester, and if you sum it up, there's almost no difference in dropout. And indeed, again, the statistics cannot tell these two cohorts apart. So the third observation actually loops back to this issue of diversity and gender diversity, because if you consider the people attending, women and men attending booted and non-booted here, and you have a look at these numbers, you realize that there is a relative overrepresentation of women, at least in relative terms. So almost half of the women, so 70 out of 153, attended booted, whereas less than a third of the men, 201 out of 645, attended booted. So what this means is that initiatives aimed at recruiting students without prior programming experience indirectly will increase the gender diversity. And this is interesting or important because in Denmark we have sort of an equal rights legislation, so it's illegal in Denmark to preferentially admit women at the expense of men. This would be discrimination. So, or this effect here is called affirmative action in the US. And so if we want to increase the amount of women admitted, we need to increase the amount of women applying. So, and I'm telling this also because there are cases in the US of universities with like 50% women, but it's important to note that they can actually preferentially admit women at the expense of men. And there's also a clustering effect that some universities with lots of women will sort of, women will migrate towards these universities. So it's not sustainable to do this for all universities. Yeah. Good. So if we now return to the cliffhanger here I gave you earlier and reveal what's behind this box here, we see that once these initiatives were deployed, we see a rather massively increase here in the amount of women on the Bachelor of Software Development. However, it's very important to note that we cannot isolate the effects. There's so many things going on at the same time. There were many simultaneous initiatives. The communication department worked tirelessly, massive effort to try to increase the numbers here, and lots of people have contributed to this. So the ones in charge of the educations, the heads of department, and I mentioned the communication department, lots and lots of people have been involved in this. So it's very hard to isolate the effects. But the good thing is we see a massive increase after ITU decided to really pay attention to this. Let me step back a little bit here and give you some reflections. So let's take one step back. So let's return to this slide here where I talked about LIPA's correlation. And when you read this, women are on average more interested in working with people than men are, and men are on average more interested in working with things than women are. Some people will think something along these lines. So we have a scale, the women are to the left and the men are to the right. But this image is sort of a misconception and sort of not really the accurate picture. So there's a bunch of confusions to be aware of here. First of all, it's not about individuals. So it's never about one particular woman versus one particular man. So, but I know someone, you know, a man who is more interested in people, or a woman who is more interested in things, all those kind of things. It's not really about individuals. It's also not about the group of all women versus the group of all men. So here, shown like this. So women are like this and men are like that. That's also a gross oversimplification that does not capture what we're talking about. So what we're talking about here are patterns or tendencies. And if you want to visualize it, I think this is the best visualization. We have a sort of a spectrum here. And clearly there's a huge overlap between the populations here. We have the distribution for women to the left, closer to people, and the males here closer to things. So, and the literature reports a 1.2 standard deviation. This is about how it's shown here on these two Gaussian distributions. So these are based on experiments with US American psychology students in the 70s and 90s. So if I give you an analogy, so this is a good analogy in some respects, and it's a bad analogy in others. So it's good because it's something we're all very familiar with, but it might be a bit deceptive because it inherently sort of depending on nature. And so let's consider an analogy involving human height. So if we look at the data, I got the data from Sweden here. The average height of a woman is 167.7 centimeters, standard deviation of 6.1. If you plot that, it kind of looks like this. And if you get the average height of a man, 180.4 centimeters, at least for Sweden, and a similar standard deviation, it looks like this. And you have a standard deviation of about, so the difference here is about 12 centimeters, no, 13, I think, yeah. And here it's about double the standard deviation here. So this is sort of an accurate picture here. Now, there's something to be aware of here, which is there's a statistical phenomenon which is relevant for this discussion here, is that whenever you have two distributions with an average in the means, or the average difference in averages, then the differences get exaggerated towards the extremes. And so if you consider the interval from 175 to 180 centimeters, you have one woman for every 3 men. And if you go out a bit further, 180 to 185, you have one woman for each 15 men. And if you go further out here, you get 1 to 80. And from 190 to 195 centimeters, you get one woman for every 500 men. So this is a statistical phenomenon related to these distributions here. And again, if we go back to our people things data now, and now I put them a little bit closer as evidenced by this previous 1.2 standard deviation difference. And if we compare the faculties, we indeed see a similar pattern. So as expected, we see exaggerated differences towards the extremities of the people things spectrum. So if we look at data from Copenhagen University and look at health sciences, which is about the physiological and psychological well-being of people, we see that there are 3 women for every man. If we go to the hard sciences, so computer science, physics, and math, we see that there's 1 woman for every 3 men. So as we get to the extremes of the spectrum, we see this polarization effect here, or exaggeration of the effect. We see the same thing if we open up faculties and look inside faculties. So if we look now at this faculty of sociology here, social sciences, sorry, psychology, anthropology, sociology, very related to people, lots of women. At the other end, we find economics with bonds and money, obviously, and economics, so much less women. If we look at the natural science faculty, biomedicine, biology, lots of women. And then as we go towards more and more thingy topics, we get fewer and fewer women. Similarly, if we look within IT studies, so this is now data collected by IT West, if we rank them on the percentage of women, we see that the 4 studies related to IT with the most women, here actually more women than men, are about health technology, welfare technology, and health technology. This is about the physiological and psychological well-being of people. And if we look at the other end of the spectrum, so the ones with the fewest women, actually almost no women, aside from one courageous woman here, we see that this is about robots, systems, electronics, and network. So inherently things. So for computer science, if we look at the picture here, computer science, at least traditionally, was a lot about things, because we needed to understand the bits and bytes and cables and plugging two computers together back in the 80s and the 90s. You needed to understand lots of things about very low-level hardware stuff. So it was a lot of focus on computer science in itself. And you might say that you have, if you look here at the picture, 1 in 10, or about 10% women. And so our proposal for computer science would be then to try to expand this even slightly towards people. We don't have to completely rethink computer science. We just have to push it slightly, expand it slightly towards people. And what happens is that these will start accelerating very rapidly. And so if we instead focus more on the use of computer science and what can it be used for people out there, so ethical considerations and lots of things involving the use of, use for people, then we start getting, in this case, it corresponds to 1 in 5, or about 20%, as we saw. So interestingly, we get a lot more women because we move into when this starts accelerating, but we actually also get more men. And this is exactly what we've seen in the admission numbers at the IT University of Copenhagen. And I think this is my last slide. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions or comments, you can post it. And I think our moderator, Lisa, will have a look at the questions here. Thank you.
Yes, actually no one asked a question yet, so the floor is open if anyone is sitting out there.
There should be a possibility of answering a question or asking a question in the system somewhere.
There is one question here. What is the content of the boot course?
So what is the content? What is the content of the booted course? Very good question. So the booted course, maybe I should just go back to the slide that's sort of mostly, can people even see the slides now? So the booted runs over 3 days, and the first day is about sort of very simple. It's about constants and variables and operators, very simple things. But for all of the exercises, all the examples and exercises are sort of wrapped in a people or in a people version, in the sense that you will, for instance, do BMI calculations, or you will do currency conversion, things that sort of relate intimately to people. So there are no sort of try to solve second order differential equations or stuff like that. It's very much sort of anchored in reality and people. And the second day is on, I think it's on conditionals and iteration and these structures. And again, all the examples are sort of relating to people. The third day is showing a bit of object orientation, and there's a little bit of more sort of open-ended, where the students can sit and work on small projects. We have a paper hopefully coming out soon, which will explain this in much more detail. Thank you for that question. Any other questions?
I got one more here. According to gender, any data to share about those who identify as others? Knowing that there's likely only a little data on people identifying as others.
Very good question. So the question is, if we have data on people identifying as not binary male or female, but as others. And indeed, we don't have sufficient data on that, unfortunately. It would be very interesting to have a look at that, and very relevant also to study this. But this is not something we have sufficient data on. you would need probably to study it at a quite large scale. Yeah, but this is very relevant to look at, absolutely. And I think it's very important for computer science to be welcome to all kinds of people. So I think this is also, yeah, somewhere where we can try to basically, yeah, be as diverse as possible. Yeah.
There's another question here. It seemed that the box for people topics was slightly bigger. Is that because you suggest to just expand the subject or cutting some things topic?
So maybe I didn't completely understand the box. You mean like the square? Is that what we... Let me go back to the slide we had a look at here. And so I guess it relates to one of the last slides. Was it this one here? Oh, you mean, I think I understand the question, so that this is larger in some sense. It can be debated whether the backline here, I mean, should be moved, but there are some very things that you obviously need to know about in computer science. So expanding in this direction here, I think makes sense. But yeah, obviously the box is slightly larger, but it's something we're facing all the time. As the sum of human knowledge sort of increases, all fields just keep growing in size. So adjusting a little bit in this direction, I don't think is going to be a huge issue. It's mostly a matter of prioritizing. And actually, it's, as our research shows here, it's almost superficially about just wrapping the exercises in a scenario. We hypothesize, so we haven't studied this, but we hypothesize that as students gain experience with programming and digital technology, that that this effect will diminish, because you will probably, this is our hypothesis, you will probably not look so much at the scenario, but try to look beyond it or inside of what it is you're supposed to do. So, but that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, more are coming now. Are there other relevant dimensions beyond the people and versus things?
Very interesting question. So if you look at the original work of Lipper, he actually tested another dimension. It turns out that if I go back, starting with, so Lipper's work came out of a context of some work done by John Holland back in the 50s. So this is a model called the RIASEC model, which is a model used for vocational interests. It's a model for what do I want to be when I grow up, and they identify six kinds of sort of vocational interest. And it turned out that later a psychologist called Dale Prediger, he found two underlying dimensions, that these 6 points actually were points on a circle was spanned by two dimensions. One of these was the people things dimension, the other was the ideas data dimension. I like to call this one abstract and concrete. So are you interested in working with concrete data, for instance an accountant, or are you interested in working with more abstract ideas, for instance a scientist working with very abstract theories or methods or frameworks? So there's also some individual preferences along this dimension, but it was tested quite thoroughly and it shows no gender correlation whatsoever. So there was a strong gender correlation on the people things scale, but not on the data ideas scale. Yeah, thank you.
More questions. There's one here. As a woman in computer science, my experience was that the people work in computer science was looked down on as soft. Have you been working on this culture as well?
Interesting comment. Yeah, so I think I can empathize with this question, that sort of the people spectrum would be looked a little bit down upon. I think this comes from, I think this was the case earlier. But as, you know, cell phones get proliferated and we all have technology and we're starting to gauge these enormous problems there are with ethical considerations and big companies harvesting our data and exploiting our data, I think these are very important things to have a look at as well. And I don't think that, I don't think wrapping an exercise in, let's say, if it deals with containers on a cargo ship, or if the exercise deals with guests in a hotel, it sort of matters a lot or will be looked down upon. I don't think that's the case. But I empathize with the question. I think this is something we should have a look at.
Yes, one more here. Have you consciously tweaked across all courses such that they meet the new revised things people balance and meeting the ethical consideration? And also, are we perhaps looking into an internal division of computer science into people versus things and digit pursuit?
Right. So I don't think this will constitute a division into two fractions of computer science. Again, I think it's mostly superficial packaging, and it's actually, I think it's a good sort of, it's actually not so hard to do, to wrap the exercises. Every time you use an exercise, a project, an analogy, try to wrap it into sort of a people theme. I don't think this is very intrusive in some sense. And what was the first part of the question again?
Have you consciously tweaked across all courses such that they meet the new revised?
Right. So the question of whether we have implemented this. We have only very recently published this research, and we are working on trying to sort of get it into at least the early courses. As I said, we don't know yet whether the effect diminishes as the students gain experience. I don't think it's so important to do on, let's say, the 6th semester. I think it's very important to do on the 1st semester, and we're studying the effect over time to see. But obviously this requires a lot of effort in convincing the teachers. Clearly they need to be on board with this. But again, our message in our recommendation was that we encourage teachers to consider favoring people over things. We're not saying that every single example should be about people. It's good to show a variety of examples, and indeed many cases where it's obvious to pick a things example. And the teacher should by all means do that. What we're saying is that if you have a choice, go in the direction of people. But yes, I think getting this out to the relevant teachers and making them aware of this very strongly documented effect, I think is a first important step.
There's a related question to that. Someone asking, I wonder what is now the actual advice? Communicate also in schools that there are human aspects in computer science so that they know. Does it also mean that we need to educate the teachers themselves?
So the question is about school and primary school and high school. We're also interested, so we studied high school and also university students. We don't know about the preschool or primary school, and this is also something where we're intending to study the effect and track it into the primary schooling system. My intuition tells me that you see this effect also for the kids. My hunch is it probably kicks in around puberty, but it's hard to say. This is pure speculation. But I think it's something we should discuss. But again, I don't see it as if it's like the human aspect of computing. That's a related question, like whether we should emphasize more all the human aspects of computing and on the balance. Our results show actually that you can superficially, if you change the theme of the exercise, it will immediately appeal more to women. But clearly, I think it's fair to speculate that also that in general, the more people-ish areas would appeal more to women, but probably also to many of the males actually, if we look at the figure here. But again, I'm speculating a bit now. Yeah.
And there's at least one more here, a more theoretical question. Is the spectrum really people versus things, or is it relatable versus unrelatable? For instance, when you talk about visitors on a hotel versus containers, maybe just more people have experience with hotels rather than container ships.
Great question. Thank you very much for that one. So is it familiarity or is it people things? And clearly we tried our best in making these as sort of people and things as possible and not have it be new versus old or familiar versus unfamiliar. And the exact example cited here in the question is actually, I think it does have a little bit of the issue of familiarity versus unfamiliarity. But we were wondering that if it was familiarity, unfamiliarity, there probably would not be a gender effect. We would probably simply see all the students gravitating towards the familiar. So the fact that we do see a gender effect here, I think is very interesting. But this is actually something that we're already studying right now, the effect of familiarity and unfamiliarity. It's a very good question. Yeah, thank you.
There's no more questions.
No more questions. I think there's also no more time.
Yeah,
So
we are almost out of time.
do you want to say a few words?
I just want to, I'll come up.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
So, thank you all very much for joining today, and thank you, Claus, for giving the talk. We hope to see you all at the next DIREC Talks. When and where we'll announce on the channels. But that's it for today. So thank you and take care.